We're fortunate to be joined by Peter Jarrett-Schell, Peter Jarrett-Schell, excuse me for adding the N there, who is an Episcopal priest and author. I'm going to keep my introduction short because I want to get to the conversation itself. And I'm going to turn it over to you, Father Walter, for our opening prayer and a more formal introduction of Peter in order that we can get to our conversation promptly. So friends, it's great to have all of you with us. The structure of the conversation today, as always, is an introduction of the subject matter for us this week by Peter. A short conversation between Peter, myself, and Father Walter, and then closing with a reflection from a few members of our community this morning who will help us personalize this conversation. It's so easy to think that the conversation of race and faith is simply an intellectual conversation, when in fact it's a very personal conversation. It's a conversation about how we live and interact in society and with our neighbors. And so some of what we hear is hopeful. Some of it is really challenging. Some of it's daunting. And we look forward to hearing how we, from a few of us around this table, are engaging our subject today. We're fortunate today that our response team will consist of Jean Redfield, a longtime member of Christ Church, Ebony and John Galuli, who have joined us for several years now, and Wendy Richards, who has been in our midst as long as I've been here. And so look forward to having this diversity of response as part of our conversation as well. So thank you to the responders ahead of time. Thank you, Peter, for joining us this morning. And thank you, Walter, for helping get us started. So Father, it's all yours.
Thank you. The Lord be with you.
And also with you.
Let us pray. Almighty God, who created us in your own image, grant us grace fearlessly to contend against evil and to make no peace with oppression, and that we may reverently use our freedom. Help us to employ it in the maintenance of justice in our communities and among the nations, to the glory of your holy name, through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. Well, thank you. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Peter Jarrett-Schell. And Peter is a person that I've known of for years. We've actually never met still in person, but screen-wise a couple of times. Peter was also a contributor to Preaching Black Lives Matter. And he is a writer and a pastor. His parish is Calvary Episcopal Church, which is in Washington, D.C., in what's called the 8th Street Corridor, 8th H as in hotel, 8th Street Corridor, Northeast in Washington, D.C. That, for Peter, is historically, that is a Black congregation, historically Black congregation that is now multiracial, multicultural. As his intro would say, he's the husband of a Black woman and the father of a biracial son. He has wrestled with this question of whiteness for a better part of 15 years. And Peter's a very humble guy. And in that context, that was what he sent as a intro. But I just want to say one other thing, that at least a point. His story is incredible. Son of a priest and a nurse. He has worked and served in El Salvador. He is, even after seminary, he worked as a pipe fitter. He has done a lot of community organizing and a lot of work in these areas of justice. But I also just want to say Calvary Episcopal Church was one of the first Episcopal churches I ever entered years ago, when we lived in only less than a mile from where Calvary is, on 8th and A Northeast. And in 8th and A Northeast, I was in law school at the time. Not far from Calvary was a terrible murder that occurred. That actually was probably one of the things that led to the 1994 crime bill. But Calvary, first I remember going there early on for one of my Union of Black Episcopalians Absalom Jones service, and heard a wonderful sermon by a now retired priest, Tony Lewis, who later taught me Greek but also the Episcopal Diocese of Washington had one of the first HIV/AIDS ministries in the country. And a priest named Jerry Anderson was very involved in it. And my wife, one of our dearest friends, one of our sons, our eldest son's first babysitters, Sam Ramsey, a fraternity brother of mine, I later became a member of his fraternity. Sam was a victim, a great school teacher who died of AIDS. And it was the Washington, D.C. Episcopal Caring Response for AIDS that took care of Sam and his family, who lived not far from Calvary. And when it came time to bury Sam, and when other African-American churches didn't want to touch AIDS, this was the early 1990s still, that funeral requiem was at Calvary Episcopal Church. And so Calvary always will be a place of fondness for me. I'm going to shut up now and probably shut up more than I normally do, since the subject is whiteness. But Peter, so I'm turning it over to you. You wrote this book. You've reflected for many years on this subject. Why?
So that is the essential question. I really appreciate that introduction. Thank you. I love hearing stories past of Calvary's ministry. Calvary's just a phenomenal church. And I think maybe like your church as well, I mean, you mentioned this piece about being willing to kind of step out in an uncomfortable place during the AIDS epidemic. One of the things that I love about Calvary, and from Walter's, what he's described to me of your congregation, it seems like a sentiment you share as well. Calvary is willing to push beyond their comfort zone, beyond their current assumptions, in pursuit of the ministry God is calling us to. And that showed up in a number of ways, and it continues to show up, and it humbles me. So I'd love to hear those stories. Thank you. Yeah, so as Walter said, I mean, I think the real question is why, and I think that's a fundamental and essential question. I really appreciated Andrew's introduction there, and he said we were going to talk about the sort of theory and the historical antecedents of whiteness, how it came about, and the theory, the structural theories of how it works, and I will get into that a little bit. But there was another piece that you hit on, Andrew, and you mentioned, you kind of referenced as well, Walter, is that those theories are helpful in kind of helping us parse out and understand what's going on around us. But unless we reach that kind of personal core of how they show up in our lives, of the emotional connection we have to them, and really that fundamental question of why do we want to engage in this work, then it will remain strictly at the level of intellectual exercise without any real capacity to change things around us. So my interest right now, and what I'm going to try to do very, very briefly, is give you some of those theoretical underpinnings, briefly, lightly, not too heady, but really to get into the meat of talking about why we should care. And I do want to begin there. White people, and I understand your congregation is predominantly, but not entirely white people who want to take on and engage the work of racial justice need to encounter and wrestle with the question of what is our stake in it. And we have to be really, really honest about that, of kind of how it shows up. It's easy for us to think of it as a kind of externalized problem. And when we do that, we will tend to show up in ways, we'll engage in ways that end up being kind of paternalistic, where it's sort of the sense that, gosh, all these poor, beleaguered Black and brown folk, they're suffering horribly. Let us, from our position of prestige and privilege, help them out, right? And engaging in that way is troubling on a number of fronts. Number one, because it is sort of paternalistic. It maintains the same hierarchy within it of like those that can offer assistance and those who will receive it. So we're still, even as we are engaging to disrupt systems of racism and white supremacy and these racial hierarchies, we're showing up in ways that perpetuate them. But there is this other question, and it is one of perseverance and endurance. If you have any familiarity, if you've had any experience with working with folks who do community organizing, one of the core principles of community organizing is that you have to organize people around their self-interest. And this is a concept and an idea that we as Christians often struggle with because we hold up and lift up the idea and the ideal of selflessness, right? That we should not be thinking about our interest in the work that we do. And I want to just suggest briefly, without getting too deeply into it, that that's actually not a faithful perspective. If you look at scripture, Jesus talks extensively about sacrifice. He talks extensively about the things that we need to give up and let go of if we want to be disciples, if we want to take part in the kingdom. But every time that he talks about that sacrifice, he frames it in the sense of what is it that we would seek from it? Why would we want to sacrifice? What, in a certain sense, do we get out of it? What's our skin in the game? So he says things like, pray for your enemies, pray for those who persecute you, love your enemies, right? Which is a great sacrifice. Most of us would struggle to do it. But then he follows up and says, so that you will be children of God. He tells us, do not store up treasures for yourself on earth where moth and rust consume. But then he says, so that's the sense of sacrifice, right? Sacrificial giving. But then he says, instead store them up in heaven where moth and rust do not consume. So perpetually all the way through, when he asks us to make a sacrifice, he also tells us why we should care about it, what's our stake in it. So there's a faithful response, but there's also this question of perseverance and endurance. And this is what community organizers will tell you. Self-interest is really important because many of us will kind of go out on a limb, acting on behalf of someone else once or twice. We might be willing to do it. We might even let someone guilt us into doing it. But inevitably, we will wear out. We will become resentful, we'll become, just tired, and we'll pull back. The immediacy and the urgency of it won't hit us as hard, and we'll stop showing up. And we've actually kind of seen that this year a little bit. I know the push, there's a new push, obviously, we've seen starting in the summer to address long-standing inequities in our society around racial justice, particularly around policing has come up, but wealth inequities as well. And we saw a huge push of committed, well-meaning white people that kind of took part in that effort through the summer. But already, only about 3 months later, we've begun to see that energy drop off. And it's partly because we haven't done the work of identifying where do we show up, what's our skin in the game. And community organizers will tell you, once you can help someone see and understand how they have a stake, how they have skin in the game, they will show up again and again and again until the work is done. And that's the commitment that's needed from us right now. So then the question is basically, well, what is our stake? What is our skin in the game? And this is where these theoretical, I'm trying to keep an eye on the time here. I'll talk long. So Walter, go ahead and jump in if, at any point, if you need to redirect. But these theoretical underpinnings kind of do help us understand it a little bit. When we as white people, if you're white identified like me, engage questions of racial injustice, we will tend to think about the ways that people of color, Black and brown and indigenous folk, are sabotaged and disadvantaged, the way they're under-resourced, right? And we'll say that that's the sign of racial injustice. That's what it's fundamentally about. And that is true, but we always have to understand that there's kind of two sides to this coin. And this is where this discussion, which I know you're all familiar with, of white privilege shows up. Part of the problem of how we usually talk about white privilege is we don't make that connection between the privileging and the resourcing that white people receive and the underprivileging, the sabotaging, and the under-resourcing that happens to people of color. And those things are connected. It's like a mathematical equation. The impetus for the creation of the system of white supremacy that we live in, it's about like 400 or 500 years old. But the impetus of it was to generate wealth for white people. So like it wasn't that white people decided at some point, gosh, like these African folk are awful, let's enslave them. That was not the thinking. The first thinking was there were white people who wanted access to free labor so they could generate wealth. And then they enslaved Black people to do that. And then they had to explain to themselves why this was morally justified. And that was where the denigrating attitudes, the hatred, and the contempt came in. So the impetus for the system of racism and white supremacy that we live in is the privileging and the resourcing of white people. And given that, that's really where the kind of question that Walter raised comes up. Given that the system works for our benefit, right? Why would we honestly want to confront it, or dismantle it? Is there someone trying to jump in there?
No, some of them may have just unmuted themselves. I'm sorry. And just to tell people, you've got until 11, and then we'll start our dialogue. So keep going, and I'll give you a 5-minute or 10-minute warning. All right. Thank you.
Solid. Thank you. So, and I'm trying to give this overview really quickly because I want to get into the meat of the personal piece. And you may be familiar with some parts of this. One thing that's really important to identify, which I mentioned there, the racial system that we live in is modern. It's actually, like, in terms of the history of humankind, it's new. And that's important to lift up because the way we tend to think about it, the way we thought about the system for a very long time, is that it was ancient and eternal, that people always, identified themselves as being Black or white or Asian or Latino or whatever. And that's not the case at all. Certainly, there were antecedents to the system. There were things that if we look in scripture, right, we can see that tribalism and tribal prejudice is present in scripture. We can read it there. The sense of the importance of ancestry and the perpetual thing of trying to identify your ancestors as being superior to other ancestors, that's there from the beginning. But the idea that you could lump all of humankind into just a couple small categories, and there was like a universal hierarchy among those within those categories, that's very recent. That's like 400 or 500 years old. And how it comes into being is a complicated story. It has principally to do with the transatlantic slave trade. It has principally to do with the institution of slavery. That's really kind of its genesis and its chrysalis. Catalyst. Chrysalis would work too. And so you can't tell the story in a simple way. But there is a particular event that a lot of people have used as kind of iconic and emblematic of how it works and operates. And it's one that's becoming more familiar to the American public, but is still generally not taught. So if you know anything about Bacon's Rebellion, you're going to know this, but I'm going to rush through it real quick. You may not have heard of it, but it's a seminal and a foundational event in the history of this nation. It happens basically to the day almost 100 years before the Declaration of Independence. And essentially what had happened was this: it's in Virginia. Slavery, chattel slavery that happened in the US was actually not the initial terms under which Africans were brought in bondage to this country. Initially, it fit into the larger umbrella of what is called bond servanthood or debt servitude or this indentured servitude. There's a number of ways it was described. But a number of groups were brought to this country, and certainly Africans were brought in the largest number, to serve to work without pay, to be held in bondage. But there was the theoretical idea that this was not a permanent condition and it was not a natural condition. So it was like a contract you found yourself in unwillingly. And the idea was, at a certain point, there would be an escape clause. Either it was a time of servitude or a certain amount of debt that you'd have to work off, and then you'd be freed. And this was the situation that both Africans and lower class Europeans found themselves in this country. Now, it wasn't equal. That's very clear from the beginning. So we see the beginnings of racial inequity even within that system of bond servanthood early on. Africans worked under harder circumstances. They generally had longer terms of servitude. They had fewer rights. But fundamentally, what is fairly clear is that both African and European bond servants during this early period understood that their circumstances were more similar than those of the landowners. So they understood that there was kind of these landowners up here, and then there was this group that had some divisions and mistrust within it, that found themselves in a similar circumstance of bond servanthood. And there's actually a lot of good historical research about that there was the society there relative to what we experience now was much more integrated among bond servants. So there was mutual. There were familiar relationships, there were friendships and things like that. And you say, well, how do we get from there to where we are now? And this is where the piece about whiteness and how it operates kind of really hits. There was this guy, Bacon. He's not a good man, and that's an important part of the story to tell. He is pushed by ideas that we would identify now as being kind of hedging into racism. He lived at the edge of the colonies in Virginia, and he was a sort of impoverished landowner. He had some terrain, but not a lot. And what he wanted was the right to push out, to wage war, to kill and claim land from Native American tribes around the edge of the Virginia territories. And the English government was not in support of that because they had made treaties with these tribes and they thought it was better to kind of hold the peace and maintain the current status quo to let things be as they were. He tried to push the issue and he couldn't. And so then he decided he was going to raise an uproar. He was going to lead a rebellion. And again, so his impetus here is actually to commit genocide and claim land from Native Americans. So we can't really hold him up as a hero. But he identified this one thing about how he could make this rebellion succeed, which is that both the European and the African bondservants were unhappy about their circumstances and were ready to do something about it. And so he kind of said, like, let's get together, overthrow this government and establish something new where you'll have a more equitable pace. And that rallying cry was incredibly successful. So both these two groups came together, and in a very initially successful thing, they pushed the colonial Virginian government right out to the very shore. So they almost reclaimed the whole territory. At which point the colonial government asked for support from the British. They got military support. They put down the rebellion. They executed the leaders. And then they basically said, we have to figure out a way that this will never happen again. And they identified that the way they were going to do that was to drive a wedge between African and European bondservants. And so very quickly after that, you begin to see a series of very draconian laws that lay out a distinction between, which was not one that people really had thought of or considered before or named, between Black people and white people. And they said all Europeans, well, some Europeans, basically early on it was white people and French people and some Scottish people were white. I mean, I said white people, English people, French people and some Scottish people were white. Whether you were a bondservant or a landowner, you were white. And what that meant is that you could not be held in indentured servitude. Joshua, I need you to close the door. Daddy's working. No, I need you to go. Daddy's working. I'll come back to talk to you later. That's my son there. Whereas Africans were now Black and they were property by definition, which was different than indentured servitude. So you never as being property, you could be bought, you could be sold. You were never expected that you would come out of this situation. You were in that permanent condition. There was no term. There was no debt you could work off. And your children would be property too, which was not the case before. Intermarriage was outlawed. All of the rights of Africans were stripped away, and a smaller set of rights were attributed now to these former European bondservants that became this kind of middle tier of folks. And these were folks who got pulled in as taskmasters and things like that. And the idea, which was pretty explicitly discussed, was that by identifying these former European bondservants as being white, that they would shift their principal interest to being with these landowners, even though they didn't share in the wealth, that they would kind of take part in that. And they would help perpetuate the system, right? They'd help perpetuate the system of chattel slavery. Because basically, and this is this thing people talk about, the wages of whiteness, no matter how bad their circumstances fell, they could always tell themselves that at least I am not Black, right? And so that happens about 100 years before our nation declares its independence, and it forms the foundation of a lot of the kind of other systems of chattel slavery that spread throughout the colonies. And the reason I'm bringing that up, and again, I'm trying to keep an eye on the time here, is that it points out to us the way that the function of whiteness initially was to get all these people who are identified as white to shift their allegiance to the idea of whiteness rather than to identify common cause with other people who weren't identified as white that may have similar interests. And we can kind of see how this continues to operate. And as a pastor, I'm always cautious about getting political, but there's really not any way to not get political about this as we discuss it. So we can see now how there are politicians and a large group of politicians that are putting forth either overt white nationalist ideas or sort of covert white nationalist ideas. and also at the same time proposing fiscal and financial policies that are adversely affect working class folks, right? And so they're pulling in a lot of white working class folks on board with it. And it is basically because at the end of the day, people will go on board with it because we all want to feel like we have a place and security and safety in the world. And if we can't find it in financial terms, we're willing sometimes to find it in kind of terms of prestige and reputation and a sense of in-group belonging. And you can just see this thing about, how we spend our time on social media right now, right? Where there's this huge industry that's driven by perpetually trying to find a sense of affirmation and affirming and belonging. So one way that we can begin to identify our personal stake in addressing and attacking whiteness is to say that the system of white supremacy does not actually serve our interests longer term as a group. We have seen, of course, and I know you're all familiar with the growing wealth divide in the country across the board, the growing class divide, and it's partly driven on the back of white supremacy. And so we have to kind of come to a place of being able to understand that if we want the best outcomes for our children, rather than to say that we want our children and our families to have better outcomes than people of color, if we want to say we have the best outcomes for all of our families and communities, we're going to have to find that together. And that means addressing systematic and systemic inequities that exist across society along lines of race. And I'll give you just one other kind of tidbit there that probably resonates, I hope. There is just extensive economic research that demonstrates that the most prosperous and content and stable nations in the world also have the greatest levels of wealth equality, right? The deeply unequal nations are inherently unstable, are inherently prone to economic drag, and inherently prone to building stress and discontent among the vast mass of their population. Well, our nation has a baked-in and structural inequality, wealth inequality that exists along lines of race. And it's not going anywhere until we address it directly, and it's dragging, to a certain extent, the whole nation down. So that's one piece. Another piece, which is a place where I think the church comes in when we discuss kind of whiteness and why we should want to address it, is this kind of emotional, psychological, and spiritual need that we all exhibit. And again, this is something that I have learned from community organizers. Community organizers will tell you that as long as people are in immediate physical distress, that will always be the first concern. If you don't have a roof over your head, if you're hungry and everything, that'll always be your first concern. But when those needs are taken care of in the most immediate sense, you don't have to be living a luxurious life, but when those needs are taken care of, other concerns begin to come to the fore, and there are other deeply human needs. We need to feel that we belong. We need to feel that we are recognized. We need to feel that our life has meaning in some ways. We need connection. These are all real, tangible needs in some sense, and they're ones the church speaks to. They are also all needs that in one way or another, our participation and our living into whiteness disrupts. And I say whiteness a lot, so if that's feeling jargony at any point, you can ask a question and I'll be happy to respond to it or challenge the way I use it. So let me give you just a couple examples of what that looks like and the ways that, that whiteness disrupts the needs of our lives. One place is in the terms of connections. I can tell you, and this is something I feel like I should tell you this pretty authoritatively and definitively, and you may disagree, but that if you are white, whiteness and white supremacy interrupts, disrupts, and sabotages every single relationship you have with a person who is not white, identified as white. And it doesn't mean that there's not love, and it doesn't mean that there's not care and closeness and affection. My wife is Black. My son is Black. A lot of our social circle and my family and friends are Black. And there's love and care and affection there. And it's also very evident that whiteness and white supremacy interrupts and sabotages every single one of those relationships. my wife and I are almost never alone from it. And so it shows up both externally, in the different ways that we're perceived, the ways that our relationship is perceived, in our economic prospects. I'm going to step away to close the door for a second. Sorry. Sorry, this COVID life, we're all working from home now. But it also shows up internally, right? Because none of us escape the conditioning and the education in whiteness and white supremacy. So I have, despite years of working on it, I have all of these narratives, these deeply distressing and racist narratives that run in my head, that influence the way I perceive my wife and my son. And all of these things interrupt and just sabotage those relationships. And if what we're longing for is real connection, we have to understand that so long as white supremacy stands, it'll always be a barrier in the midst of these relationships. And so that should be a reason that maybe we want to tackle it. There are other things as well. One thing I think that's a deep need on all of our parts is to give a sense of who we are and where we come from. And one of the agreements of whiteness and white supremacy is that whiteness, for those of us who are identified as white, whiteness matters more than our ethnic heritage, and in fact, in opposition to it. And this is a little tricky for us to get to because we tend to think of whiteness as being an ethnicity. We may think of it as having a cultural heritage. But it's notable that, for instance, and there's research about this, generally across the US, white people will express having less interest in learning their family history and ancestry than will people of color. White people, if you ask them what their cultural values are and their cultural practices, will generally have a much harder time answering those questions. And it's partly because we have one of the agreements to become white, and there's like this process of different groups becoming white throughout history. So I said initially it's basically English, French, and some Scottish people, not all of them, but some. And then like Irish people get added in and Polish people get added in, and there's this kind of gradual accumulation of other groups. But there's this way to be added into it that you kind of had to give up your own cultural legacy and heritage. And so you'll notice, you can sort of think of it in our thinking the way that people who are identified as white, who still have a very strong connection to a particular ethnic identity, if it's expressed in terms of their cultural practices, the holidays they observe, the food they eat, and all these sorts of things, they're identified as being like kind of ethnic and therefore not quite white. And the archetypal example of that in our nation is the example of Ashkenazi Jewish folk, who are generally identified as white, but are always kind of like, there's something not quite white about them. And we have seen in this current white nationalist moment how that's actually put Ashkenazi Jewish people in this nation at risk and jeopardy. So you have to kind of agree to slough off all this stuff, which is why we're like, well, what are our cultural values? What are our resources that we've learned from our ancestors and our history? Maybe a lot of white folks can't even actually answer the question of what is their ethnic heritage? Which nation did their peoples come from? And that happens very specifically. There's a great book, if you're interested in it, called How the Irish Became White, which describes this. And basically it is these two things. One, you kind of have to give up all that stuff and agree to kind of be a little bit more homogenous. And the other piece is you have to agree to participate in anti-Black racism. And when you do those things, then you get considered really white. The problem is people need culture. People need a sense of who their ancestors are to be able to give them a sense of who they are. And not having those things produces a sense of distress and a sense of uncertainty and sort of lack of mooring. And you may, some of these things may resonate with you deeply. Other ones you may say, that's not really the case for me. White supremacy is not absolute. There's always kind of fragmentation and fuzziness around the edges. White supremacy never won the victory completely, though it won a very substantial, it has a hegemony right now. But it's not complete. So there's ways in your own life that this may not resonate. But for many of you, I think it might. And this produces, I suggest, why this is kind of whole discourse around cultural appropriation, right? Like, why is it that a lot of, if you look right now, like a lot of younger white folk are really interested. We just had this in Day of the Dead celebrations, and then kind of like perceive Halloween as being this kind of like non-event, right? Or this kind of like weird thing that we just don't have to do anymore. And it's partly because the cultural history of engagement around that holiday is missing. So we look at other people who have these deep cultural values and these deep cultural connections, and we want what they have, and so we will like try and take hold of those things, and identify how we can appropriate and take hold of
When
those.
I went to the other.
Sorry, that just someone had unmuted themselves.
Yeah. So partly there's an effort at kind of reconstructing our own history and our own heritage. That's a part of it as well, that whiteness and white supremacy disrupts. And the last part, which for me is very deep and fundamental, and I think should be for all of us as Christians, is that we say as Christians that our fundamental location and identity is in Christ. And Christ tells us that, being a follower of the way is all about knowing the truth, right? He says, know the truth and the truth shall make you free. It is all about identifying the image of God and the presence of God and the Spirit of God that is within us, which is something we share generally, communally among all humankind. And there's this whole region of our identity, right? This sort of placeholder, which should be our ancestry and ethnic history, that is founded on a lie, this lie of white supremacy, one, that we are one people together, undifferentiated, and two, that the nature of who we are as people is superior to everyone else. These are both fundamental lies. So if we want to really know who we are, we have to abandon those lies and find a way to move beyond them. And then we are also at the same time identify that we are one people in Christ, that we are all made in God's image and filled with God's Spirit. But the function of white supremacy fundamentally is to divide us from the rest of humankind. And so there's a way that we have to understand that as Christians, we can never live into that deep calling that we long for as disciples of Christ, as people who are named and claimed by Christ, so long as we continue to live with white supremacy. And I got 4 minutes left. So then, having said all that, that's a lot. I went too long in the theory, and I'm sorry about that. But my interest really is to help myself and other white people, one, to really begin to really notice the ways that whiteness operates in our lives and to disrupt them, and two, to really say that this is something that I'm willing to sacrifice for, to put skin in the game for, because I think the value is there. And that's hard work. A lot of white people who learn like the theories of whiteness and white supremacy and everything come to this idea that whiteness is just a construct, and so we can abandon it. Essentially the idea that we imagined our way into this problem, and so we can now imagine our way out. Well, unfortunately, as we imagined our way into it, there was this kind of like, I don't know if you've ever seen Fantasia, but there's this like Sorcerer's Apprentice dilemma where we started this thing right out of our imagination, but now it has a life and energy and motion that's bigger than us and beyond us. And so we have to do systemic work. And so as much as I might want to tell myself, I'm not white, like I understand this is a fallacy, perpetually every day, there are systems that work to reassert the fact that I am white. And that, for instance, in my life, very personally, that I am white and that my wife and son are not. And if I really want to claim and live into that truth and promise, then we have to begin addressing those systemic issues. And one we have to address, and I see you got 3 more minutes, so I'm going to get right there, and Walter, I'm going to keep an eye on the time. But a really fundamental one we have to address is the question of wealth inequity. And thankfully, there's been more attention on that recently. We used to talk a lot about income inequity, which kind of conceals the actual state of the problem, because income inequity is bad. But when you look and you're like, okay, like, women of color make on average 60 cents on the dollar compared with white men, that's bad. That's clearly really bad. But you're like, okay, but you're still like the same order of magnitude at least. But when you look at wealth and you say the average white family owns 10 times as much wealth as the average black family, then you're like, this is a whole other level of problem. And we have to address it. We will never get past the situation we're in right now unless we address that problem of wealth, because wealth, though for some reason we as Episcopalians don't like to talk about it, we are per capita the wealthiest Protestant denomination. we don't like to talk about it. But as followers of Jesus, we should know Jesus has no problem talking about it, right? So if you look and you just mark it off by the numbers, Jesus's number one topic of teaching is the kingdom of God. And it's basically that's the world and the way God wants it to be. And the number two topic that's deeply enmeshed with it is money and what we do with it. And so Jesus says, if you want to take part in the kingdom of God, you have to look at these questions. And they are tough questions, because when we see like a 10-to-1 gap in wealth, it feels insurmountable. And a lot of us these days, as I said, we're all living into this kind of growing wealth inequality. So we may say, look, I don't seem to be wealthy. I can't really go on a vacation when I want to, and these sorts of questions. But we can still identify ways that wealth inequality shows up in our lives. And so like questions, and you don't have to answer, but just to think about, if you went to college, were you able to pay for that on your own? Did your parents help you pay for it? Did you leave with debt? If you bought a house, were you able to, were your parents able to help with the down payment? Were you able to get a competitive interest rate? Were you able to purchase a house in an area where the value of the house would appreciate and grow wealth? As you worked to kind of gain a foothold in your life and some stability, were you basically able to invest in yourself and your family? Or did you find that because you were an outlier in the financial situation of your extended family, that maybe you're the first person to kind of be able to step some level into the middle class, that other members of your family needed your assistance, not just wanted, but really needed it, and you found that you were having to kind of help and loan out money to make that happen? And these are things that kind of fundamentally shift dynamics. So you may say, look, I'm not wealthy, but you did graduate college without debt, and you are able to pay a mortgage on a modest house. And when you find a little extra money, you are able to kind of invest in things that matter to you. These are all ways that might fundamentally make your circumstances different than a coworker of color who's making relatively similar wages, but their wealth situation is different. And that's something that I think we need to address. And I think that, and if I could talk about it more later, I will, but if not, it's fine. Churches in particular have a very powerful way, I would suggest, to address it.
On race, which is an exploration of our identity and our ongoing privilege that white community experiences even today. It's one thing to talk about the history, to talk about even the economic inequalities that others are experiencing. But when we start to talk about whiteness and the privilege that comes with it, we start to talk about gross point.
Mm-hmm.
We start to talk about ourselves. And that's a really rough, difficult place to go. So my first word is thank you for helping lead us into this conversation. I want to highlight a couple of things that really stood out to me. One or two things I want to tease out a little bit more. I was really grateful you started there and you actually brought us back. So kudos to being able to do this. You started out by acknowledging the connection between economic inequality and economic privilege. Early on, you said it's like a mathematical equation that, if someone's got a little bit more, typically that means somebody else has a little bit less. Those weren't your words, but you started there and you brought us back there really well. And I just want to acknowledge that I think that's one of the hardest parts of this conversation, and one that we need to talk about more. And I want to dive into that a little bit more. Mm-hmm. But there was another thing that you were talking about. It was kind of woven throughout the conversation. You even noted it. You said I talk about whiteness a lot. You gave us some good history. I think opening up Bacon's rebellion for us and seeing it not just as a moment of colonial response to British authority, but also a racially impactful moment in American history, if you will. So giving us some history about whiteness, could you unpack for us a little bit more when you what for you or in your exploration, what is white? Can you help define that for folk a little bit more today, as opposed to just because I think here's the stumbling block I think we experience is we think of whiteness historically, and racism alongside of it as something that is what 19th century Southern landowners were. And we look around and say, well, that's not me. So how do I participate in this? So what is whiteness in your experience today? And if you go a little further, how does it interrupt, as you said, every relationship with people of color, minorities that you encounter? Help us explore those two a little bit more.
Sure. That's the really fundamental question is how does it get personal? And it does show up a lot in relationships. You're right. So like one of the peculiarities about white supremacy and how it operates is that the fundamental underlying logic is always the same, right? It's like it's actually not creative in that sense. But it is, in a sense, very savvy, such that it's always able to kind of like adapt to new circumstances. So I don't know how many, if you got a lot of readers in the congregation, if you've read Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow, a big part that she writes about is the way that the system of white supremacy develops and adapts over time. It's also a great book. It's I wouldn't say it's a fun read, but it's a very engaging read, so it's easy to get through. So yeah, our circumstances are very, very different right now. And one of the things about it right now is that it tends to be much more polite and sort of covert, but no less detrimental. So how does it show up to like interrupt relationships? It'll be things like this. In any given circumstance where like a dinner party or a professional event or something like that. My wife's also a clergy person, so we do, before COVID, we did go to diocesan events and other professional things together frequently. People will pretty much, in any given discussion about, whatever the topic may be, but something that's kind of perceived as having some kind of expert value behind it. So if it'd be like politics or science or art or whatever, people will generally assume that I know what I'm talking about. In fact, if the conversation comes up, people will ask me, my opinion on things that frequently I am not qualified to speak on at all. And one of the peculiarities of if you live into that a long time, as most of us who lived under the system for a long time, is that you'll begin to feel comfortable talking about things that you don't have any expertise about at all, right? And I can see how this is not the case when I begin to notice it. And it's so natural, right? That we just assume that this is how things are. So we don't even really notice what's going on. People of color almost always notice because they live into the opposite side of it. So like see the dynamic going on. So this is like the situation of when I say how it interrupts, a very personal example of how it interrupts. Having my wife and I go to a clergy event. This was even before COVID, and people were talking about engaging with online technologies and live streaming services and stuff like that. And there were a couple of different congregations that were talking about how they were going about this. Rondicia worked professionally in television. It was before she came to clergy work. She worked for a studio on the technical side, on the editing side, and she has very much worked to keep those skills current. So she knows the stuff about live streaming backwards and forwards. Anytime, now that we're in COVID time, we're both dealing with, all this thing about putting our services online. Anytime I have a technical issue, like I will ask her, and I try and learn these things, but it's just like she knows this stuff backwards and forwards. If you listen to a transcript of the conversation we were having at this event, and you had no names in it, it would have been immediately evident to anyone listening to the words that were said very quickly on that she knew what she was talking about, right? That she understood the challenges and things people needed to think about, not only on the technical end, but also on the kind of engagement end of what will grab people's attention, what will help them engage. All of that was very clear. And yet in this conversation, people kept turning to me while we were standing there together to ask my opinion, right? And I don't know anything about this at all, except the little things that occasionally she's told me, like today, like you see me here and she like talks about how you have to frame the shot and like make sure that you're not like that. Like these are little things that I don't know, but she has taught me. I don't know any of this stuff. And having lived into that experience of being assuming, you know, everybody assuming, and me as myself assuming that my opinion matters on all matters of whatever they may be, I was answering the questions, being like, just with my random opinion, you know. And so what's happening in our relationship at this point? Well, here I am, her husband, right? The person who is supposed to be her life partner, the one who's supposed to support her. And it's, to me, it's a casual conversation. We're just chatting, right? And she is being denigrated. And this is that two sides thing we're talking about. Like my elevation specifically had to do with her denigration at that point. And I am not noticing it, right? And so this is like an interruption in very personal terms in our relationship that breaks down trust, that breaks down empathy and things like that. These sorts of things happen all the time. And I will tell you that generally speaking, Black and brown and indigenous folk are keenly aware of them. They notice when they happen. And generally speaking, because it's not uncomfortable for us, because it's very comfortable for us, we don't notice. And even that gap in noticing when it happens is a rupture in the relationship, because we're partners, right? We should be in it together. We should be able to identify the challenges we face together. But a lot of the time, I can't even see them happening. So a lot of the time when whiteness sort of shows up, it shows up in those ways. Now, if we're talking about like more systemic things, in terms of wealth that we were talking about and the ways that it shows up now. Again, we've gotten very polite about this, and our general societal thing of not talking about wealth and money, you know, that we have a big taboo around it that's very damaging for these conversations. I hope I got time here. I won't offend anyone. I think it's very emblematic. I had a colleague who talked about in premarital counseling, and you're not going to get any details here, don't worry. But he had this whole thing about how he wants couples to be able to communicate about deep matters of great importance so they can work through issues. And that was his only interest, about how they communicate. And so he asked them, you know, about this, like, one thing, and he laid out topics that he wanted them to be able to talk about. And he said, like, can you have a comfortable conversation about your sex life? And then he was blown back because they went like deeply into detail. I'm not going to get there. Don't worry about it. And he was like deeply uncomfortable. And he's like, okay, clearly you're comfortable about that. Can you tell me about how you deal with your finances? And they were like, no, we can't talk about that. That's private, right? And that disunity is absurd, right? But it's very real. So like, we don't talk with our coworkers about how much we make, right? And so even the information about the fact that, you know, me and the person sitting next to me are doing the very same job, but getting paid differently, is not necessarily information that we have available to us, right? Or that we share. So it's very easy to cover these things over, but it does show up in terms of, you know, hiring decisions, in terms of pay decisions, in terms of evaluation of houses. There was one recently that was kind of all over the news of an interracial couple that were looking to sell their house. And they went, the wife, who was Black, met with the realtor to get the appraisal, and it was appraised at one value, and they were not pleased with the value. And again, this was this rupture and disunity when they talked about it, though he was willing to trust it. But she basically told her husband, if we want to get the price we want, you have to meet with the appraiser when I'm not around. And he was like, I don't think that's the case. But he, stepping out on trust, he did. And immediately the value of the house went up like 10% or something like that, because the appraiser was meeting with a white person, said this is a house that a white person owns. And the appraiser probably not only wouldn't say that, but probably wouldn't even think that explicitly. Like if you ask them, why did you make this decision? They're saying, well, I'm just looking at the house. So it shows up in these kind of covert ways that have very real impact. And so for us to begin to think about them, we need to be able to identify where and how it happens in our lives in the moment. And as you said, Andrew, at that very personal level, because when we get into these conversations about white privilege, we do tend to sort of abstractify it. When I started having these conversations, it was with an anti-racist white affinity group. And, everybody was talking, they all talked about white privilege. We did too, I did too. And there's this article that's very famous that describes this by this woman, Peggy McIntosh, called The Invisible Knapsack. And she wrote this article basically after having a conversation with a Black woman friend of hers, I believe, who was talking about all these things she could do, that you could do as a white woman that I cannot do as a Black woman. And she didn't quite believe it, but then she said that when she was lying down to bed that night, and like a very specific thing that had happened that day came up, and she wrote it down, and then she made a practice of logging and journaling all this. So for her, it's this deeply personal thing of cataloging her life. And what we were doing when we came to talk about white privilege is we were repeating verbatim the things that she had written, right? And so we were kind of willing to acknowledge that white privilege was a thing in our lives, but we weren't actually looking at our lives to see how it shows up. And so we have to begin doing that work. Because all of those interactions have very real consequences, like the one I just described with my wife and this kind of IT tech thing. We all know a lot of how you get a job is based on personal connections, right? And so in this conversation, apart from like the elevation and denigration aspect, part of what's happening is the people in the group are credentialing, right? And thinking like, oh, this guy, Peter, knows about IT stuff, right? This woman, Randicia, does not. And if it comes to a question of a hiring decision later on, that conversation, what seems very casual, has very real impact for her professional future. So those are like things we have to be able to look at and find ways to disrupt.
I could continue to dive into this, but I also want to hear from Walter and your interaction with Peter, Walter, and some of the questions that you've got for him.
Walter, you're muted.
Thank you. I encourage folks to read the book. Peter begins with a context where, and I know actually I've met his wife, Rondija. We did training years ago with Eric Law, but he and Rondija, their son, who was only about 2 at the time, and Rondija's brother were stopped by the police. But and it's just a lot of vignettes that show this. And having been married 38 years, your context of what you were just sharing is quite interesting. But that the difference, actually, that context of that story, and Father Drew put it in the chat section for folk. The New York Times article, it was $135,000 difference, and it was not simply that the white partner had to meet. They literally took every piece of Black art, every photograph of a Black person out of the house. And the Black wife and the biracial Black son left the house for the appraiser to come up. It was actually even a little bit higher than the comps in the neighborhood. That it's just, and when you think about home ownership, is for most people their greatest sense of wealth. Some people have stocks and others equities. When you think about, and here's where I want to get nitty gritty around Grosse Pointe. When you think about then the inequity of how we fund our education system in most of America, including the state of Michigan, I'm just going to leave that open to people. Then this is not about 2 people in a household. It's not about personal responsibility. That's all important. But this is a structural issue,
right,
that goes on. I would love to hear from Ebony and John and Wendy and Jean for your reactions or questions.
Well, Father Peter, thank you. And you asked a question, what more or what can a church do? We are rather new members to the Congregation of Christ Church of the last several years. And one of the first things that caught us was listening to the preaching and seeing the diversity in color in preaching, but addressing the question. And I'm a native of Grosse Pointe. I grew up and went to school right next door to the church, grew up 5 blocks away. live now still 5 blocks away from where I grew up. Did not know what white privilege was. Now I do, in part. I am still learning every day. I am married to a Black woman. I have 2 Black daughters as well, one in elementary school and one in grade school. And boy, it's been eye-opening. It's been eye-opening to say the least, and experiences I can't, an educated attorney I'm married next to, and I share the same experience as you two, that people think sometimes I know everything when she knows 10 times more than me. I see it in the way our daughters are treated. I see it in the way we're treated in stores when we're separated, quite frankly, or when we go to car dealerships.
Mm-hmm.
But we really appreciate the way that you and Father Drew and Father Walter and other members of the congregation, quite frankly, address it. How we say that there is an issue, how we've got to continue to go forward, and what can we do. I guess most troubling to me recently is once you experience it and you know the feelings and you see the tears and you say this can't go on and you see the rage, you just feel the rage finally. About what's going on in the community, and you see it, is how political people these days can continue to sanction, so to speak, white supremacists, or not denounce it, or not rally against it. And that is the most troubling, how once you see it in their eyes, how anybody can continue to say that it's completely inappropriate or to call out these types of people. And while I thought it was getting better several years ago, I think it's getting worse.
I agree that I do think we are on the downturn, though I will say, I mean, the recent kind of mobilization is potentially hopeful. Again, like I think it's important for us to lift up the fact that white supremacy is not absolute. It is not. It is very powerful, and it is like a clear kind of imperial hold on us right now. But we as people of faith do uphold that there are things more powerful than anything of human creation. And we can actually see in our history, there have been moments where we could have made a different choice, right? So I'd say kind of the 2 biggest inflection points we could look at were during Reconstruction and then the Southern Freedom Movement, the Civil Rights Movement. And these were both moments where as a nation, we like turned towards this question and said, you know, maybe, or we need to do something about this really and make serious change. And there was effort and energy to do that. And then there was significant blowback, a lot of it very violent. And then we kind of said, okay, this is too rough. We're going to turn away and let things go back to the status quo. We may be in such a moment again. I think there's a chance that we're actually in kind of one of those inflection points again, which means that we again have the opportunity to really shift the dynamic. We are seeing kind of, as you mentioned, John, we're seeing real violent pushback on that now. And the question will be, will we decide that this pushback is so disruptive that we're going to lean back and sort of say, okay, enough? Or are we going to say, we need to stop this cycle. We need to do something different. We can't be doing this again in 20 years. And churches, again, I think have a great power to act on that. Churches basically, as much as churches are, I mean, we all know this story, we talk about it, are in decline across the nation. They are still one of the only bodies that gathers communally to talk about ethics, right? To talk about what is right and what is wrong and trying to live into it. And to the extent that we're quiet about these things, you know, we're basically baptizing injustice as being part of God's will. Churches have a lot more, still have a lot more authority and clout to actually shift things in their local community than we think. You might be surprised if you show up, for instance, at I don't know what the though, I mean, Walter, you told me a little bit that Grosse Pointe is actually like 5 municipalities. So I'm not quite sure what the governance is there, but things like you show up at a city council meeting, right? Nobody shows up at city council meetings. Nobody wants to be bothered. You show up at a city council meeting and you say, and it's helpful if you can get, you know, the backing of the rector and the vestry, but you say, I am here representing this congregation, right? And I see this issue and we care about it. You will actually be surprised, right? Because nobody's showing up. Suddenly these elected folk being like, do they vote? Is this a whole group of people I'm going to have to deal with in the next election? Like there's weight that you can push dynamics. And we can also lead by moral example. And so like we were talking about wealth, and I know people kind of heard the question, it's in the air, the topic of reparations. And I know that's always just like, oh, how do we do that? And partly I think it's like the fear of the magnitude when we begin to consider the question of like, not just from slavery slavery, but also through like convict leasing and Jim Crow and redlining, segregationary housing practices, mass incarceration. Like the debt seems huge. But if we kind of begin to break it down, and I'll be happy to share this information if you'd like later, I can send it to Andrew. There are ways to break it down that kind of give you a rough sense of what the actual magnitude of the debt owed is. And when you break that down and sort of say, okay, we can't pay this all at once, but we could kind of agree to do an installment plan, like the way we do mortgages, right? And you can argue these numbers, but you might decide that it's something like identifying that you need to transfer about 1.5% of your total wealth a year for 30 years, right? And that's like tough, but it's actually doable, right? And like, we're talking about churches. We're talking about people who make sacrificial giving part of their life. And what if our churches themselves decided to do the same thing and sort of look at their property and sort of say, our predominantly white churches, and say, you know, whether we can track it or not, we understand that these systems of inequality are part of the way that our congregation got its property. And so we want to think about what can we do about that? And made that commitment and say, you know, we're going to figure out a way to do this, to contribute financially 1.5% of our total net assets for 30 years. And we're going to identify a partner in the community. We're going to identify a community organization led by Black folk or people of color, where, you know, Latino, wherever might be appropriate for your context. And we're going to make this transfer on a 30-year commitment and say, we trust you. We're looking, you want to find, you know, you have to discern a reputable organization. But we trust you, and we want to work in partnership with you. And we want to not only hand this money over, but we also want to work with you and see how we can volunteer to help support the work you're doing and actually build relationship even as you're working to shift the dynamic of your community and congregation. I understand from what I hear from kind of Walter, your congregation's at a pretty healthy, stable point. So a lot of our Episcopal congregations are really struggling. I still think you should think about it. But a lot of our congregations are really struggling right now. And I know you hear this at diocesan gatherings and stuff. So a lot of our congregations are facing, even our predominantly white congregations, are facing a situation where like, it looks like slowly over the course of the next 20 odd years, they're going to slowly diminish, right? And many of them will make the decision, okay, we've got property and we're going to like parcel it out. We're going to sell this piece here to contribute to an endowment to be able to stretch our livelihood a little bit longer, right? And basically what you're doing at that point is, you know, you're Esau selling your birthright for a pot of porridge, right? That it's going to disappear and there'll be nothing. And no one will be like, well, there was a church here at one point, we don't know. And if instead you decided to make that sort of sacrificial leap of faith and you're saying, okay, like we're in a position right now, looking at the trends, where it looks like God is calling us to an act of sacrifice. And rather than just like claw on and see how long we can like cling to the edge of this cliff, we're going to make that leap of faith and say, we want to do this. We want to take what we have, and instead of seeing it parceled out to developers that are going to do whatever they do for their profit motive, we're going to work in partnership to promote equity and equality and justice in our community, right? And to be able to say, like, one, you might be surprised at the effect that has on the congregation, right? Because one thing these young folk are looking for more than I say that makes me feel old now that I said that, these young folk. But one thing, if you're looking at younger demographics in terms of their interaction with church, one thing they're looking for is authenticity and commitment. And if you were a church that was doing this, they might say, this church is doing something bold, right? And even if that didn't happen down the line, if the church did say, okay, we're leaning full into this, we're making this investment, it had to close its doors at one point. To be able to look at the community and say, even if this church isn't still around, the legacy of our faith is here, is a more equitable and just neighborhood that we can see in concrete terms. That's a powerful witness and a statement to the faith, and one that I would certainly want to be part of.
I want to give, you've got one city councilman you were already talking to, 3 lawyers.
Oh, wow.
And Jean, who works in business and banking. So when you're talking about wealth and law, there's a lot of talent that I want to get. And Wendy works particularly around justice issues.
Mhm.
Ebony, one of her clients is a lot of the largest municipalities. So I want to give them a chance to share a bit, if we could.
This is Jean. I don't really have any direct full-time work commitments on issues of racial justice, but definitely have a passion for it. Two ideas that came through to me that really struck me as kind of new things for me to spend some time thinking about. One is the idea that you mentioned around community organizers really trying to get at the core of self-interest. So one of the things that for me is kind of moved is this idea of what is the self-interest in white people understanding whiteness and doing something about it towards racial justice?
Mhm.
What is it about our own lives that is diminished because of racial injustice? And how do we get more in touch with that?
Mhm.
And the second idea is kind of related to it, and it was the comment that you made around that we often are living from our perspective of prestige and privilege, and that right there is a limiting factor. As long as we're living from prestige and privilege, we don't even know that we're actually living from ignorance.
Right.
We're actually living from exclusion.
Mhm.
We're actually cutting ourselves off from what we say is the sort of underlying purpose of living in community as God's children.
Mhm.
So for me, those were two really important ideas to kind of take and chew on for a while. Is, you know, the how do I call myself on the prestige and privilege and recognize that it's actually ignorance?
Mhm. Yeah.
And how do I get myself out of that ignorance and into both the intellectual content of real fact and real reality, but also the experiential content of what it looks like to learn at the visceral level of what it is to be white in a racially unjust or unjust world. So those are the two ideas that stuck for me. So thank you, Peter.
You're welcome. Jean, thank you for that. Now, one thing that you highlighted there was that sort of sense of the importance of adopting like a learning and growth mindset. And I think that's really important for all of us doing this work. It is very tempting, especially, you know, like this happens now. Sometimes people ask me to come speak to like be like, I am now like the white expert on these things. And that's
privilege, right?
yourself, yeah, you're setting yourself up hugely for failure. A much more healthy and productive thing is to be like, I am approaching this with an attitude of humility, and I'm curious about the things. I'm rather than sitting on the knowledge I do have, I'm curious about the things that I don't know. And to notice your blind sides. I mean, which one showed up here right now. So I just noticed in the comments. First of all, Tina, I saw your comment that yeah, absolutely. Gender was as much as play in this conversation that my wife and I had around technology with these folks. That's very true, and that's very real, and that shows up in our relationship as well. But the other thing I noticed was Walter, and I appreciate you like fact checking on the example that I shared, right? Because I was like, oh, like they got a 10% adjustment in appraisal, and you were like, no, it was actually 40% higher, right? And I had read the article too, and I had forgotten that. For all of the work that I have done to try and like help myself be more aware of these things, I still fall into the habit of diminishing how serious the problem is, right? Which I did right there. I read that 40%. I must have read the same article, but somehow in my brain I was like, well, it couldn't be that high. It's probably only 10%. No, it's like almost 50%, almost a 50% increase in value. So that's very, that is very real. The other thing that I would lift up in what you said, Jean, and this is a kind of language that we know from churches as well. We know from spiritual language, but we know from the way we talk about our own lives that sometimes there are things that are like poor copies, pale copies of good things that God intends for us, right? So like the classic one, and church has all kinds of attitudes around sex that we probably need to address, but the classic one is how we talk about the difference between lust and love, right? Like that's a thing. But the one you're talking about as well of like prestige and privilege being a kind of stand-in for something that we really long that God wants for us, right? Which is recognition and meaning. Like those are things that God does want us to have in our lives, to be seen, to be known, to be acknowledged, and to find meaning and purpose in our lives. Those are great things. And you can fill up, and you have a longing for it, right? And you can fill those things up with prestige, right? You can fill it up with privilege, but there will always be a sense of being like, this is not quite what I'm wanting.
Mhm.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Ebony or Wendy, would you all want to jump in?
Thanks. Sorry about that. I couldn't unmute myself. I guess I just want to say a thank you to Father Peter and of course the Christ Church for putting this on, because I don't know, again, John already gave some of our background, but I'm raised in Detroit, very different circumstances from John here in this Grosse Pointe enclave. And the one thing I guess I just see is that it's going to take education and open-mindedness of, I'll say, people who identify with the whiteness or the white privilege in life. And for my part, I am an attorney. We go through some of the same circumstances that Father Peter and his wife do. And I saw the comment, I think gender is part of it. Definitely, we've got that issue. I feel like a lot of time I have the double X on my back, gender and being Black. But what I find is that a lot of it is really miseducation or maybe just not knowing the history. So again, thank you for the history lesson today. I'm not sure how many people didn't know it before, but it made my heart sing to hear just again the lesson. So I guess what I do in my everyday experience at my law firm, where I'm only one of 2 Black attorneys right now, I've been there for 18 years, doing a traditional insurance defense work that most Black people wouldn't even know what that is, quite honestly. But I am open in being myself, answering questions. I think that is helpful. I find, unfortunately, a lot of white people just have not had the experience of meeting and spending time with Black people. That is an unfortunate reality. When Father Schell talked about it enters every aspect of your life, it does. Work, sporting activities, taking a walk around the block here in Grosse Pointe, our daughters going to the store and the playgrounds, playing with their friends, how their parents interact with us coming to our house, some of the things that are said. But again, I just find I have to be open. I have to hope that they are receptive and open as well, because that is, I think, the key for learning and changing this. And there are major systems we have to change, but in our individual lives, we have to be cognizant. And again, I know I feel like I'm more sensitive, and John probably says I'm sensitive to some things, but it is that sensitivity that I think if white people could take the time just to start learning and reflecting on, that we'll start making headway. And I think we are in the 3rd wave of some kind of change in this country. And of course, I think Black people are going to continue to fight in the NAACP and all of our groups, but it is time for white people to step up, I think, and do the work. And it's self-reflection, it is reaching out, and I think it's involving our church, our government. I think it's all hands on deck, and if we do it, I think we'll all move forward. If we don't, I think we continue this in another 20 years, as Father Schell said. So I'm sorry, but I love this. I appreciate all of you taking the time today and every day.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. I saw in the comments some of the questions about the discussion about reparations, and obviously, as some people noted, Coach's article, "The Case for Reparations," is kind of a big seminal piece. I have some other articles that I can kind of share about that.
Please do.
And a particular piece actually that I wrote with some references about how churches might participate. But there are efforts on that now. A lot of religious institutions, a number of seminaries have worked on that. There's a Lutheran pastor, Lenny Duncan, who's working to get the ELCA to really take a substantial effort around reparations. So there's energy and motion around it now.
Along that line, and then I wanted to jump in with Wendy. This is ongoing work. This is not work that's complete in even one generation. The Episcopal Church was Back in the 60s, there was some real work around reparations and utilizing endowments in different ways. Several churches redirected their endowments, sold off endowments, but that work continues. And even if whatever work we take on today, there will still be work for our kids to do tomorrow. And so I think it's important for us to recognize that it's not enough to say, well, it was done 50 years ago, therefore we don't have to do something today. The realities and the inequalities around race, around gender, around, I mean, so many issues of inequality continue today. And it is, I think one of the most dangerous things that has been said, not today per se, but over the years, is that the work of dismantling inequality is the work of the disadvantaged. That is not true. It is the work of those of us who experience privilege, that we have to dismantle the systems that we have put in place to privilege ourselves. We have to become aware of the privilege. We have to become aware of the underlying systems that we have built up in order that we can dismantle them. And so this is generational work that will have to continue. So I just want to echo, I look forward to Peter, to hearing and seeing some of the articles you've said. Wendy, we've been dying to hear from you. I've been dying to hear from you. I wonder, kind of, where are you in this?
Hi, thank you so much. So I could talk about this for hours, and Peter, thank you so much. It was really a fantastic lecture. And thanks, Jean, Ebony, and John for your comments too. So one thing that's really like resonating on a personal level, and I think beyond the systemic or structural issues, but on a personal level, this issue of like a false expertise and being a savior in a way when that's not what we as like white people, identify as a white person, that's not the position that we should be in. And I am a lawyer as well. I worked at 2 pretty large law firms. And at one point, I decided to leave my law firm and work for a nonprofit that focused on community development through like sort of organization, empowerment, and legal assistance to nonprofits like community organizations. And me coming as a white person, even though a woman, and I had my own issues, as a woman, right? But as a white person, went to elite law school, went to 2, elite law firms, came into this position, and there were several really brilliant Black women on staff at that organization. And yet I was brought in as an expert. I'm not an expert at all, right? I'm a lawyer. I was not an expert in this area. I was the one who was kind of given opportunities that I don't think they necessarily were, or put in a position of given advantages in certain environments with funders, with recruiting, with being considered a speaker in certain events, that really was a real problem. And that's in the community of like, it should be more enlightened and better at recognizing this. And it was one of those experiences for me that I still struggle with, that I see I was really blind, and I had a very so many blind spots to it, maybe because I was on that flip side. Someone's going to lose in this. I was winning, they were losing, and it was hard to see. It took me a few years really to work through how bad the system really was. And again, not a bad organization, it's the system. And it's something that I still feel like I atone for still, feelings of guilt about this. We can't come in as in a charity sense. It's not about charity. It's not about, feeling good about ourselves. It's about lifting up good work and supporting Black and Brown communities in a way that is self-directed, and we are there to support. And I think that's really important for us to recognize. Now, since then, I've left that nonprofit. It's an amazing nonprofit, by the way, and they do great work. And it is led by a very amazing Black woman now, and it's fantastic. But I am now back at a law firm, and I run the pro bono work at Miller Canfield. It's a law firm in Detroit, based in Detroit. And I'm still in this position where I'm being asked to lead groups on anti-racism work, right? So I am now in charge of the Law Firm Anti-Racism Alliance voting rights group, right? I'm a white woman, like I should not be in charge of this group. I'm very happy to do it. And going back to your issue of like, where can we help with systemic change? Where can we make a difference? Where can we put our energy? This is like what works for me. But you got it again, I'm once again put as the person of power, and that's not right. I should be supporting someone else. And so I'm happy to do that work. But it is this tension of like, this is where I can do the most good. It's where my skill set lies. It's where my passions are. And it is systemic and structural change in a real meaningful sense. But law firm consortium and trying to change voting rights rules so that Black and brown communities can actually, have access to the ballot meaningfully and have effects in government. And yet I really should not be the one leading this, right? And so there's this tension. Yeah. I will say from a personal standpoint for the church, it is one of those places that it is the moment where I feel personally very reflective and grounded in how this does fit into a bigger purpose for all of us and how we fit into a community that addresses this holistically and together. And there's a lot that we can do as a church to show that this is like a moral and religious issue, really. It's not something that we just do because we want to feel good and go away. This is something much deeper and more profound. But again, as a white person, I will never get past that tension. It is always going to be there, and how do we work through that? But
yes. You're absolutely right, and you will never get through that tension. And I think that's something that we have to accept from the get-go. For white people to engage in racial justice work is always messy, and it is always compromised. And so again, I think rather than like taking the expert mindset of being like, okay, like how do I get this right? A better thing is to take a humility aspect and go and be like, I am going to mess up along the way, and my concern is to try and do better each time. And there's always going to be a negotiation, and it's always like a tension. You said, like, so on the one hand, you're absolutely right. We have the most ability to actually affect systemic change within the networks of sort of power and access that we already possess, right? And white people do have access there. And so if we're not doing that, then yeah, we're basically just supporting the system as it is. But then there is a real danger in like stepping in to be like, okay, let me leverage this thing because I know that people will listen to me, to like, are we just reasserting the dynamic? And it's always going to be a negotiation. So like in your sense, be like, yeah, okay, there are these groups of people who will listen to me and not a person of color about these issues. And so like, let me do that. But also as I'm doing that, be like, okay, if I'm being asked to chair this anti-racism group, saying I'm going to need a co-chair, right? I'm going to need a co-chair who's a directly affected person. And we together are going to negotiate about how we distribute work and work on that. That has to be part of this agreement. And so there are ways that, and it's never going to be perfect, and you're going to mess up along the way. And the important thing, I think, is for us to take a growth mindset, and that's not alien to our faith, right? You all, if you're all baptized, you've been to a baptism. You know what a baptism is? This question that the priest asked before actually doing the baptism: will you persevere in resisting evil, and whenever you fall into sin, repent and return to the Lord, right? And there's 3 steps there, right? It's a beautiful short little sentence. First thing says, like, I'm going to strive against this with everything in my being to be the kind of person that God wants me to be. And also I acknowledge that along the way, it's not a question of whether I'm going to fall down. It's a question of when it's going to happen, right? And then we say, but we don't stay there. We fall down, we get our face in the mud, and then we reach up and say, Jesus, give me a hand so I can try and start again and do better this time. And that's the attitude of growth that's required of us. You mentioned, and I didn't want to hit too hard on it, but I think there's a helpful distinction that I've heard a number of therapists make that I think is really helpful, because when we talk about this, like the topic of white guilt comes up. A lot of therapists now will make a distinction. Either they'll say it's between healthy and neurotic guilt, or sometimes they frame it between shame and guilt. And the idea is that there is a healthy response of guilt, which is basically what we do in confession, to say like, I did a thing and it is not reflective of the person that I want to be. This is not the kind of way I want to show up. And I acknowledge the fault and I say, the question I want to do is, how do I make amends and move forward? And that is engaged, that's healthy, that helps us grow into the kind of people we want to be. It helps right the wrong when it was done. And when it's done, it gives us kind of a road mark to say, okay, I'm going to try not to fall into that trap again. And I'm going to move forward because there's still more work to be done. But sometimes we get into the shame mindset, which rather than saying like, I did a thing that doesn't reflect who I want to be, it says, I am a bad person, right? And this is like, and you have seen, I'm sure you've seen, well-meaning white liberals who just get into this thing about like beating themselves perpetually about white privilege. If you watch, they don't actually do anything about it. Like when we get into that mode, you're just like beating yourself up about it, but you're not actually shifting the dynamic at all. And so shame like gets very self-centered. And rather than working on how do I make restitution and move forward, it just gets into being like, gosh, I'm so awful. I'm so awful. That's not helpful. That's not what we're called to. But there is a kind of healthy guilt that says, yeah, like this is not who I wanted to be. I did hurt someone. I did push someone to the side. How do I make restitution? How do I acknowledge it? How do I move forward? And then say, I'm getting up tomorrow and trying to be the kind of person that I want to be. And so I think that's helpful for us. That distinction is a helpful one, been for me at least.
Peter, I know I suspect I speak for all of us that this conversation can go on and on. It's a rich conversation, and hence we have a year's worth of sacred conversations to be a part of. And so I have the unenviable task of kind of drawing us in for a close. But I got a couple of things to maybe help us make a gentle landing of it. First, Jean has been threading a question in the chat for some time that I think is a really important one for us to unpack for a moment. I think, Jean, correct me, Jean, if I'm not articulating your question very well. But Jean is raising for us is what is the self-interest in exploring whiteness and dismantling it for those who benefit from whiteness. We know, if you will, we know the good that white and racial inequality brings to white society. What's the benefit of dismantling that? Help us unpack that for a moment. And then I have one final question that I want to invite you into as well.
Okay, so that's a long question, but the short, and I hope I'm not reiterating myself. In immediate material terms, the fact is, when you look, and there's like all this information about it now, about like worsening health outcomes for people who are identified as white. There's still better, when we talk about that's important. Health outcomes for the white community have been on the decline, whereas for communities of color, they've generally been on the increase, but they're still much better if you're white. Like your health outcomes are going to be much better if you're white, but we're seeing this kind of decline. We're seeing, even as white families still do have 10 times the wealth of Black families, we are seeing a decline of the white middle class, right? So like the current system we live under is actually long-term really not working out well for white people. And if you think, like, talk to white millennials about, like, none of them ever expect to be able to own a house. A lot of them are asking real questions if they were able to start a family. A lot of them are basically expecting that they're never going to pay off their student loans. So we're seeing that, like, the way things are right now is actually not working well for us. And whiteness is part of the system that perpetuates the way things are. And so we could get away from a place of like saying like, I don't want to be at the top of the pile, right? I want us to have a better footing across the board. And part of the way we address that is in terms of addressing the systems of white supremacy. We're not going to get there without dealing with them. So there's a material concern, but there is also these immaterial concerns that I think are just as substantial. Here's how you know, and this is maybe me being Pollyannish and hopeful, but I would say this, here's how you know that white people actually do on some level want genuine and real connection with people of color, right? Because we're always wanting to stop talking about racism with people of color. We want to have that relationship that's not interrupted by white supremacy, but we're not willing to make the sacrifice to actually get there. But there is a longing to say, like, I want to be with you as a friend. I want to be with you as a co-parishioner or wife or a spouse or father, son, whatever. and have it just be on the terms of our relationship and our mutual care, right? I long for that. We can't get there as long as white supremacy still exists in the nation, right? So there still is a longing, and we can get there. And there is a longing to be the kind of people. So like I had a really interesting talk a while back with this woman who was a neurologist, and we were talking through the same kind of stuff with her congregation, and she was translating everything I was saying into like the language of neuroscience, which was really interesting. But she said this thing about how your brain is a reward-seeking system, like it seeks things that kind of feed it. And she says there's abundant research that shows that the most satisfying emotional experience someone can have is when they have lived into the values that they claim to uphold, and they've done it with cost. So basically, when you can, and this is something we know as Christians, we talk about the joy that comes with like real sacrifice and real commitment. When you can say, today was tough and I sacrificed for it, but at the end of the day, I can say I showed up as the kind of person that I want to be, right? That is one of the most satisfying experiences you can have as a human being, right? And that is something that for us as white people, when we begin to understand the way these structures of whiteness are operating in our lives, requires us to confront white supremacy. We will not like get the joy of finding out who it is that God calls us to be without it. And this is something where I think the church is uniquely positioned to speak this language, right? There's not many institutions that talk about those things, about our deep values and how do we live into them. So.
Thank you for that. And if I could add, and who am I to add into this conversation? As a biracial man, as a Native Hawaiian Caucasian, one of the things that strikes me in the increase or the heightening of whiteness is a loss of identity. The loss of an identity is something unique that both to individuals, but also to cultures, that there are unique qualities and gifts that we each bring. And one of the evils of whiteness is that it flattens and eliminates all of that distinction that makes us, shall I say, both unique and beautiful. And so when we talk about dismantling whiteness, I think we're also talking about building up the beauty and uniqueness and appreciation for the beauty and uniqueness that cultures and people individually bring. And so there's so much to be gained by this dismantling of a system that kind of flattens out in a remarkably disempowering and unequal way our society. And so I'm excited to continue this work here at Christ Church, and to invite us into, I think another part of this conversation is to I love the image of the backpack that you introduced for us. Like, what are the privileges that we carry around with us, not just around race, but race being a fundamental one. We've talked about it more in the chat today around gender privilege that we bring, sexual identity being another, economic, education. I mean, we live in a society that privileges certain things, and those privileges also disempower so many. And so I look forward to continuing this conversation in the weeks to come. I'm going to do a shameless plug for the weeks to come, and then Peter, ask you a final question to kind of tie this together. So next week we continue this conversation as we explore whose land is this, exploring Indigenous history. We've talked about and are keenly aware of the rupture we have as an American society around African American and white history, but also we need to explore our relationship to our Indigenous brothers and sisters across this land. And so we're fortunate to have Caitlin Curtis, who is a member of the Potawatomi Nation and author of a book, Native Identity, Belonging, and Rediscovering God. Caitlin will be joining us. It's a recent book that came out about a year ago, exploring this very conversation from an Indigenous framework. And so I look forward to Caitlin joining us next week. Looking a little further out, Helen Santees threw out a book in the comment section by Thomas Chagru. And the title escapes me, forgive me for the moment, but exploring the roots of economic divide, particularly rooted here in Detroit. Thomas Chagru will be joining us in a few weeks after the new year as well. So we've got his voice to look forward to in January. We've got Caitlin's voice to look forward to next week in particular. So please continue to join us for these sacred conversations. Peter, a final question. We've had a rich conversation that I know I and others have enjoyed, and you've shared a lot with us. You've got an opportunity to share one last thing. What do you want us to take away from this conversation? If we hear nothing else, what do you hope we hear and chew on in the days and week to come?
Okay, so I want to leave you with 3 questions then that I want you to kind of ponder and reflect on. So if you are white identified, I want you to leave kind of considering how will I notice, what am I going to do to notice the ways that whiteness does show up in my life, in my daily interactions? First question. Second question, to really ask yourself, where do I find my stake in this? Why did I show up at this meeting today? What, for me personally, what drives me to want to do this work and to really claim that and hold it and be able to describe it as clearly as possible? And the third question, knowing those things, seeing the way whiteness, white supremacy shows up in my life, understanding why I care about it. What am I actually going to do to confront it within my circles? Those 3 questions, and I'd ask you to live into it. I want to hit on one other thing though that you said, because I can give specific examples. As you asked the question about the whitening effect of whiteness, and I want to leave us off on this note, but there you go. And to give a real specific example, when I began to notice that, my wife did kind of push me on this of being like, what are the actual cultural values that are of your people? I made a strong effort to reconnect with my grandmother because she was the only person in my family that I knew that had a strong sense of this. She was very, very proud of being Scottish, and particularly of being a Campbell, which is like one of the larger Scottish clans that generally has a bad reputation in Scotland. But she was proud of it. She was real proud of it. And I reached out and connected to her on that basis to try and be like, help me understand these things. And there were 2 real benefits that came out for me. One was that she died recently. She died at the beginning of this year on the West Coast. And honestly, if I hadn't made that push to say, I want to reconnect with this, I would not have known her as well as I did in those last years. And she would have died and I would have left with a great sense of loss about it. But the other thing was this amazing recognition. When she was telling me about what it means to be Scottish and her sense of what Scottish people are like, there were all of these things about my family that we always tell these things that are just like, my family is just weird, right? There's just like all these things about like the way that we use sarcasm as a basic form of communication, which like that's the ground state, you know, the way that we're always ready to jump in to like fight and be like, people, your neighbor, whoever, should just be allowed to do what they want and live their life the way they want, and all these things, the strong emphasis that we put on extended family and cousins that I had never met. All these things that like we tend to say, if you're white people, it's just the weirdness of my family. No, that was my family being Scottish, right? And I would have never known that if I hadn't reached out and connected. And so these things that about family dynamics that for a long time I was just like, this is just all the weird eccentricity of my family, and didn't value in that way. I was able to understand. I was like, no, this is our history and legacy. And it is one of the things that I can bring with me and carry with me. And there's a great sense of power and pride in being able to hold on to that. That is not rooted in whiteness or privilege. You know, it's a sense of who I am as a person and the legacy I inherit that's different and in some ways can push against it. So yeah, there's a great value in being able to reconnect there.
Yeah. Oh, Peter, what a wonderful, wonderful conversation today. Thank you for joining us in this sacred conversation, helping us to explore, again, I think one of the most difficult parts of these sacred conversations, which is our whiteness and the whiteness of American society, the whiteness of Grosse Pointe society, and the implications that has, and how we both benefit from it, as well as continue to participate in it, and hopefully how we begin to dismantle it for the best, for the better for everyone. So thank you for joining us today and helping to lead us. To everyone, thank you all for joining us, giving us a reason in some ways to have these sacred conversations. Grateful for you listening in and continue to offer your thoughts and in the chat, and or directly to me or to Father Walter in the days to come. And we will capture those 3 questions that you offered for us, Peter, and we'll push them out to the congregation here in a couple of days. So a final thanks as well to Wendy, to Ebony, to John, and to Jean for opening yourselves up to all of us in these conversations as well. It's so rich to make these sacred conversations personal. So thank you guys as well. Till next week, look forward to seeing all of you on the 13th. And Peter, again, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It was a pleasure. God bless.
God bless all.
God bless.